Hey, it's Professor Gould, and in this set of lectures, we're going to start talking about cells and all of the parts of the cells, which, as you know, are the basic units of life. And the first thing we need to talk about is cell theory, which again is a scientific theory, and it seems like a very, very basic observation at this point. And it says that all living things are made of cells, and all cells come from other cells. It seems very obvious at this point, as many scientific theories do, because it has been shown through, well, every research, really everything, for so long. But that is the defining theory of cells. So there we go. Now, some of you may be thinking, okay, at some point there had to be a first cell, right? Yes, we will come back to that. You need to learn a little bit more about cells before we talk about how cells develop. So we're going to talk about the parts of cells first, and then we'll figure out where the first cell came from. All right, so there are two types of cells in nature. There are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Karyo means nucleus. Eu means true. So eukaryotic cells have a true nucleus. Prokaryotic cells, pro means before, they don't have a true nucleus. Both kinds of cells are surrounded by the same thing that is called a plasma membrane or a cell membrane, and it is made up of what we call a phospholipid bilayer. I will come back to that. Don't worry about that yet. Both of them have DNA. In the prokaryotic cell, the DNA is a single strand that's in a loop, and it's twisted up into something we call a nucleoid. In a eukaryotic cell, there are multiple chromosomes. They are in a straight line, not in a loop, and they are held inside a nucleus, which also has a membrane around it. Both types of cells have structures called ribosomes that make proteins. We're going to talk a lot more about those. And both types of cells are filled with what we call the cytoplasm. And the cytoplasm is just everything that's inside the cell except, in a eukaryotic cell, the nucleus. Okay, so it doesn't include the plasma membrane and it doesn't include the nucleus. In a prokaryotic cell, there's fluid, which we call the cytosol, and then there are things called inclusions, which are chemicals and other structures that don't have membranes. In a eukaryotic cell, there's the fluid, the cytosol, the inclusions, and then there are also these things called membrane-bound organelles. And we're going to talk a whole lot about those because those are really important. First, we're going to talk about the prokaryotic cells and the characteristics of prokaryotic cells. All prokaryotic organisms are unicellular, meaning that the organism itself is a single cell. Now, sometimes students get confused with this terminology, and I hear people say prokaryotic cells are unicellular. Well, of course, a cell is unicellular. A cell is one cell, and unicellular, uni means one, so unicellular means one cell. So make sure you're using the right words. A prokaryotic organism is unicellular. Some prokaryotic organisms are made up of cells that work together in pairs. Sometimes they sort of form a colony, kind of, or a bunch of them together. It's complicated. You're going to learn all about this when you take microbiology. Most prokaryotic cells have what we call a cell wall. This is different from the plasma membrane. It surrounds the plasma membrane, and it's different molecularly. It's called peptidoglycan, is the molecule that it's made up of, which is a complex molecule made up both of sugars and amino acids. The structure of the cell wall can be used to distinguish between different types of bacteria. So there's something called a Gram stain that can very easily distinguish between these two main types of bacteria, or whether they have a cell wall with something around it or not. And those are gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. So if you've ever heard those terms, that refers to the cell wall and whether there is another layer around the cell wall. So this is what sort of an idealized prokaryotic cell looks like. The single chromosome, it is a loop, and then it's all twisted and bundled up. And so when we see it under a microscope, when we can see it, it looks like just this solid region. It's called a nucleoid. Now, oid means kind of. And so it's not a nucleus. It's like a nucleus, but it's not a nucleus because it doesn't have a membrane around it. It's a nucleoid. Okay. So whenever you see oid, that's like kind of a thing. So a factoid is not a small fact. It's sort of a fact. Okay, what else does it have? It has a cell membrane, and that is this layer here. The cell membrane surrounds the cytoplasm, okay, which is everything inside. It has a cell wall around the cell membrane, and then around that, some of them have a capsule as well. And again, that's going to distinguish the gram-positive and gram-negative. We're not going to go into that in much detail in this class, but that's microbiology. There are also often extensions of the cell membrane or the capsule extending out from the cell. The little short ones that look like little hairs are called pili. Pili means hairs, so those are hairs. This long one that kind of looks like a tail or a whip is called a flagellum. Flagellum is the singular, flagella is plural. Okay, so there may be multiple flagella, or there may be a single flagellum. Got it? So those are the things we tend to see in prokaryotic cells. There may be pili, there may be flagella, there may not be. Okay, it depends from one type of bacterium to another. Now, one thing that is really important to remember is that prokaryotic cells are really, really small and much, much smaller than eukaryotic cells. And that's going to be really important later. So in this image, this is taken with just a regular microscope. All of these little dark purple dots, these are Salmonella bacteria. And then these larger structures here, these are human cells. Okay, so you can see how much bigger these large cells are than these tiny little Salmonella bacteria. This image here was taken with an electron microscope. An electron micrograph is an image we make with an electron microscope. An electron microscope is many, many times more powerful than a regular microscope. We'll talk about this more in lab. And so that we can see much smaller structures. So this is a bacterium. It's a different bacterium. It has a different shape. And these are human cells. And so you can see here that even though this is at much higher magnification, these cells are much, much bigger than these little tiny cells here. Okay, so eukaryotic cells are always larger than prokaryotic cells. Even the smallest eukaryotic cell is bigger than a prokaryotic cell. Now, let's talk very quickly about the basic structures that we see in eukaryotic cells, and then we're going to go more in detail in all of the structures that we see. They are surrounded by a plasma membrane, which we call the cell membrane, and inside the eukaryotic cells, we have these things called organelles, which means like little organs. They are structures, each of which is bound by a membrane that's just like the cell membrane. It's the same molecular structure. It's a phospholipid bilayer, but it's inside a cell. So it's like a little thing inside a bigger thing. Each organelle carries out a specific function in the cell, and we're going to talk about all the common organelles and what they do. The largest organelle in most cells is the nucleus. It is also the most easily identifiable because it's usually darker than the rest of the cell, and so it's easy to see. Now, inside the cytoplasm is a fluid that we call the cytosol. It's mostly water. It does have some ions and small molecules dissolved in it. It surrounds all of the organelles and all the structures inside the cell. Eukaryotic cells also have these things that we call inclusions, which are chemicals and structures that are not surrounded by a membrane. So the ribosomes, don't worry, we're coming back to those, they are inclusions, not organelles, because they don't have a membrane. So this is a graphic indication of just a sort of idealized animal cell. The cytoplasm is all of the stuff, all of the organelles except the nucleus and except for the plasma membrane. So everything inside the plasma membrane except for the nucleus. And the cytoplasm includes the other organelles, all of these things, and the cytosol, which is specifically the fluid. The inclusions are also part of the cytoplasm. Okay, so if we look at an idealized eukaryotic cell, this is an animal cell. A plant cell is going to be structured a little differently. And an idealized prokaryotic cell, we see that the prokaryotic cell is much smaller. It has a cell wall and possibly a capsule. The animal cell has the cell membrane, the plasma membrane, but it doesn't have a cell wall. Okay, it does have a nucleus that has a membrane, and it has all these other organelles that have membranes. Okay, so in the next section, we're going to start learning about the plasma membrane, and then as we go on, we're going to learn about the other organelles inside the eukaryotic cell.